Coming up, remembering the Reverend Samuel Berry McKinney.
My mind is made up. I'm on my way up. I'm going to hold my head up. And where are you going? I'm going on. Oh, I will jump in.
A social justice and civil rights trailblazer in Martin Luther King County. We reflect on his lasting legacy next on a special edition of King County Connects. Welcome to this special edition of King County Connects. I'm Enrique Cerna. We often cover the issues that are important to this region, but we also cover the people who are critical in bringing about positive change. People like the Reverend Samuel Berry McKinney, who passed away on April 7th at the age of 91. He was a man of faith and a civil rights icon, willing to take a stand, and in the process, he helped make Martin Luther King County a better place. He was the senior pastor of Seattle's Mt.Zion Baptist Church for 4 decades. Under his leadership, Mt.Zion grew in numbers and in prominence as the most influential African-American church in our state. He didn't do it alone. By his side was his wife, the late Louise Jones McKinney. Together, they were quite a power couple. In 1998, as Reverend McKinney was about to retire from Mt.Zion, I had the opportunity to produce a special for KCTS 9 looking at his 40 years of faith, challenge, and accomplishment.
As the civil rights movement heated up in the 60s, so did activism at Mt.Zion.
And when they get voting rights in Alabama, they'll be further ahead than we are here.
Reverend McKinney was in the midst of it all, pushing hard for voting rights, along with an end to discrimination in housing and employment.
We had all types of protest meetings, and people would gather to air their feelings about things were not happening in the community, that things that were happening that were not right. They had to have a focal point of place for beginning, and so many, not all, but many of the marches, most of them, originated at Mt.Zion.
But these were stressful times, especially for the Reverend's family. His prominence in the civil rights struggle brought death threats.
We were aware that there was, as it were, a hit list on the leadership of this community, and his name was right there on that list. The girls were, of course, very aware of a lot of the threats. We could not allow them to answer the phone, nor could they answer the doorbell, because we never knew what they would encounter. It was frightening. It was very, very difficult. But we believed in what we believed in the movement. We believed in the cause, and we felt that we could overcome anything that we had to.
In 1965, Reverend McKinney traveled south to join Dr. King in a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Shortly thereafter, he heard a disturbing prediction from his longtime friend.
I was in Atlanta and had dinner in his home, and he mentioned that he knew that he would be killed. He said on any journey there's a point of no return. He'd gone too far to turn around and come back.
The assassination of Dr. King in 1968 changed the tone of the civil rights struggle. In Seattle, members of the Black Panthers and others called for more militant action in the fight for civil rights.
Some groups within the African American community, who felt that nonviolence had not worked, became sort of turned on the persons who had given leadership in the civil rights movement as being unnecessary, called them Uncle Toms. There were some threats.
You're going to have a rude awakening.
The purpose of a threat is to intimidate, scare, stop you from doing what you're doing. And I just had to say to some people and say, hey, do it.
As long as they can't go anywhere in Alabama and Mississippi, you can't go anywhere either.
But also, if you're going to do it, be prepared to face the consequences.
Joining me now are two people that knew Reverend McKinney very well. King County Councilmember Larry Gossett, and Nate Miles, a close friend of the Reverend for many years. Gentlemen, welcome. Good to have you here, and thanks for taking the time to talk about this icon. He really was an icon in this community. I know
Thank you.
You both knew him, you both worked with him, you both got chewed out by him a few times, I'm sure.
Yes.
Larry, what do you remember most? What was your biggest memory that you had about the Reverend? Maybe when you first met him. I know as a young man.
Well, I met him when I was about 12 and a half, 13 years old, 1958, when he first came. And I remember the unusual enthusiasm that was emanating from the congregation at that time, because he had already made a name for himself in Cleveland and a couple other places where he had been both a pastor and a leader of the African American community, because he always felt, and this is important about his legacy, he's always felt that black pastors had a special obligation to be leaders, to be aware of issues that are facing the black community, and to educate and mobilize and inspire them to get involved in making the entire community, whether you have gone to his church or not, a better place for all people to live in. That's what I remember about Reverend McKinney.
That was the one thing about him at Mt.Zion. That church was not just an African-American church. He made it very clear that anybody could go there.
Oh, the whole thing with Mt.Zion is it was one of the most, Enrique, it was one of the most accepting churches. When it was a melting pot. On any given Sunday, you could find the United Nations in Mt.Zion. Every color, creed of the rainbow, Reverend McKinney made come to life. He was so forward in his thinking. People would put busloads of kids would have heard about this church out in Carnation and come there, visiting dignitaries from Japan, China would come there to visit. And so it was one of those things, you just never knew who was going to be there. All you knew is when 1045 came, you better have a seat in one of those pews, because there was going to be a show put on, because Reverend McKinney and the legacy that he had already began creating mandated that you have a seat and watch what took place.
How did you first meet him?
Well, when I came to Seattle as a student in 1980, someone told me about, I was born and raised in the church. And so they said, if you want a church, you need to go by Mt.Zion. I was a pretty big activist out on campus. And so they said, if you're going to be an activist here in Seattle, you need to go by and see Reverend McKinney. And it was almost a love affair at first sight. When we met, he started telling me about getting involved in the community, about things that I needed to do, people that I needed to meet, and he kind of instantly became a mentor of mine, sending me it was back in the Sam Smith day, where they'd give former city council member Sam Smith. They'd say, go down and meet so-and-so, tell him I said it was okay. And so I'd go and say, Reverend McKinney said to meet you, and you'd get a job. Reverend McKinney said that I should come down and see you, and you could get an interview with someone. And so I went down and met a lot of people that way. And that was how I kind of got into society here, if you will.
Right. You opened the door.
Exactly.
Yeah. That voice he had. It was, what a voice. I mean, he had this deep baritone voice. And he also had this speaking style, to me, that was, it wasn't fast. It could be when he was preaching, but a lot of times it was very thoughtful in how he would say things that I think could really make a point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember I was in the congregation visiting one Sunday, and he said yesterday on Saturday in very deep baritone voice, as you've indicated, Reverend McKinney turned to the congregation and said, yeah, these three black people came up to me and talking about, we heard that you had a woman preaching last week, and a lot of churches don't allow women to preach. And he quickly told them, Mt.Zion is not like any other church. We believe that we're here for everybody. And if we have women that are capable of giving the message, they gave the message last week, and they're going to continue to do it in the future. And I've never seen a congregation react as responsive that day as they did to his remarks.
I remember him saying this, I don't know how many times, talking about the church being a place, it was opening the doors for those that were locked out, locked up, the last, the lost. He had this way of saying
the
that.
last, the least, the locked up, the left out, the disenfranchised, the disinherited, the damned, the despised. I mean, just on and on. And he would get on these rolls, and I mean, and he put everybody in there, which meant there was a place for everyone. And that was Reverend McKinney. That was what he, and it wasn't just something that he said for rhetoric. He believed that.
And in fact, as you mentioned, he was one of the first in this town, as far as the church was concerned, to open the door for women to be ordained and to be able to preach in the church. And he was very progressive in opening up the church to people from all walks of life that weren't getting accepted elsewhere.
Very, very progressive. He had so many constituents, particularly a lot of black teachers, that were raising concerns with him about the lack of quality of education in the schools. And around 1966, he proposed, and a lot of other community-based organizations, as well as black pastors, everybody got together and said, we're going to boycott the predominantly black schools, or any school that black youngsters are currently going to in '66, in order to make the point to the school board that we want to improve the quality of education for all black children. And then he called himself, no, for all children. It's going to include blacks once for all. And I'm asking everybody to keep their kids out. And furthermore, my wife is going to lead the effort to identify teachers for the liberation schools that we're going to have instead, and it was a phenomenal success in '66.
Let's talk about his partner, who I mentioned briefly in the intro, and we saw in the clip, and Louise Jones McKinney was, and I mentioned they were a power couple. In many ways, she was this outgoing, kind of unfiltered, dynamic woman, teacher, principal, and pretty good match for him.
Yes.
Yeah. Because she really made a difference.
She absolutely did, and she had this style. She had such class about her. If there was one story that I will always remember about her, she came over one day. She called and said she's coming over. My wife and I had one child that at the time Reverend McKinney had christened, and they were her grandchild, Gabrielle, and Mom called and said that they were coming over. And so she came over and she brought a Tiffany box in. And so she had this silver set, and it was a place setting. And so she looks at Gabby, and here's this little baby that she looks at her and she says, if anyone, and it had the soup bowl, the fork, the knife, and the spoon. And she said, I just want you to know your station in life. You are going to be raised by two good parents, and you're going to be in a great household, and you're going to have a great life. And you're going to marry a great individual, and you are going to do nothing less than that. And the person that marries you is going to get a wonderful young lady. And if they say, don't act like you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, you say, as a matter of fact, I was. And my grandies gave it to me. Right there, it set the tone for how Gabby's life was going to be. Yeah. And she meant that. I mean, that's the way Mrs. McKinney was. She had this style about her. Mm-hmm. And I would love to say that she did this for my child. But she did that also for so many other people's child. When she was the assistant superintendent of education, she wanted all of these children to get an education. Mm-hmm. When she took on the Mt.Zion education program, she wanted to make sure, as Councilman Gossett said, that these schools opened up and that all of these children got a better education.
That's right.
And that was her, I mean, now education, she believed, was the great equalizer.
Right. And so she was that other side of him that pushed for those things that as a minister, you know, he could put out there and say, we need this, and she backed that up. She really backed that up. So, you know, I found it interesting when I did the interview with him years ago and talked to him I don't know how many times, is that initially he wanted to be an attorney. His father was a preacher, obviously, and he came from a preaching family. And then he surprised his father by deciding that he would become a minister as well. And I remember him saying that one of the reasons is that he was told by one of his professors, like at Morehouse, that the thing about an attorney is that you're dealing with injustices after they've already happened. But as a preacher, you can take on those injustices beforehand and maybe have a voice, and there's something about the church and all of that you're able to say and to really go out there and preach. And that's what he did throughout his career in so many different ways.
Yeah. I would say that he was the supreme faith-based justice leader throughout Seattle and Martin Luther King Jr. County, because he's the organizer of the Central Area Civil Rights Committee in 1964, and then he led the boycott, and then he wasn't scared of Black Power after '68, and helped define that in the broader community to make it more acceptable. And then in the '80s, when Jesse Lewis Jackson came and said, "Pastor, I'm running for president," he immediately said, "It's about time we get a viable Black candidate." And he led the effort to build the most dynamic rainbow coalition in all the country here in Washington State. And Jesse got 20% of the vote in '84 and 39.5% of the vote in '88. And Jesse himself said, no way this would have been done without Reverend McKinney's leadership and all the other rainbow activists that we got involved in this movement. He was a very special person.
If you were a politician, you needed to have
I'll try to put that in.
you had to have his support, right? That was very important.
Yeah.
People would come to the services, those that were running, to make sure that they were being seen, and somehow they were going to get his endorsement. How critical was that for them?
It was very important. After the first time I ran for office, he endorsed me every single time, and it was always important to have his support, and also the support of the pastor at Fang, First AME, because that was critical to winning. And then in '99, the time that you're speaking of, when he was thinking about retiring, '98, '99, he led the effort to rename this county, along with Eddie Wright Jr., renamed this county after the late great, and also schoolmate of his, Martin Luther King Jr.
That's right. He was the one that helped bring him to Seattle.
Yeah, in 1961, the only time Martin ever visited our community.
Yeah. But also as part of this, I know that although he didn't tell people how they should vote, he wasn't shy about telling them how he was going to vote. And so, as I understand it, people were always, they wanted to hear where he was going politically, and that actually kind of swayed them oftentimes, right?
That was his famous line. I can't tell you how to vote, but I will tell you how I'm going to vote. And most importantly, make sure you vote. Okay. So that was the thing, because he believed so much in people voting. But you had also said, Enrique, that there was this big push about the clergy that he joined. One of the things that I do as a business executive that sometimes gets lost, everyone says, Reverend McKinney did this and he was a civil rights leader and all the rest of this deal. But there was also a civil rights piece to Reverend McKinney that gets lost. If you look at Mt.Zion as a landowner in the central area, Mt.Zion did a lot because of Reverend McKinney. He saw the need to acquire property in case the church wanted to build daycares, in case the church wanted to expand and do some. So he was always forward thinking, some senior housing and that sort of. So he was always thinking, forward thinking in that. But also, I'll never forget the day that I went over to his house and he said, "Brother Miles, it's good that you're doing all of this." And so I said, Reverend McKinney, you know, he said, we got a lot of politicians around here, and if you want to get into politics, that's fine. He said, but who do we have downtown? And at the time, he was on the board of Washington Mutual Bank.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, we also got to talk about who's going to replace people in these type of positions in business. And you will notice that as a tribute to him, when he passed away, the Puget Sound Business Journal had a huge piece on him that ran 2 or 3 times. And I haven't seen that kind of coverage on an African-American person who was not a business person in the Puget Sound Business Journal. It's because of the respect that he had by the downtown business community. And he had a that's because he had a silver rights mindset about him too.
Yeah.
And so that's something that shouldn't be taken for granted either, that he forgot about that. He talked to kids about their jobs, and jobs equal money. SOIC that he helped to found up here was all about getting kids jobs.
He led the founding.
Establishing a bank.
That's right, establishing a bank.
Liberty Bank.
That's a whole part that sometimes gets left out, but it was an economics agenda that Reverend McKinney talked about as well.
Okay, both of you have kind of personal stories connected to the Reverend. Let me begin with you, Councilman. Way before you were a councilman, and the young activist in this town, you got yourself in a little hot water with the Reverend.
Yes.
When they were building a new church.
Yes, the great edifice that exists now was built in 1970, 71, around that time frame. And I was right in the middle and at the height of the effort to open up the construction industry in greater Seattle community.
Early 70s, right about that.
Yeah. To open up the construction industry and have it hire more black apprentices and journey persons. But they weren't listening, so Tyree Scott, the head of the United Construction Workers Association, along with me and many other black activists and progressive Latino, Asian, Native, and white activists in Seattle, start closing down various sites. One day, Tyree drove by Mt.Zion and saw that there was all white construction workers. And without really dealing with it with the group, he said, oh, we're going to close that down tomorrow. And he put the word out, and about 50 people joined him the next day to close down. The next morning to close down Mt.Zion. We closed it down, didn't let the people work. But after we did that, the outcry from African American people, everyday people like Emma Cotton, Tyree's aunt, Johnny Kelly.
Your mother?
Yeah, my mother. They got very upset. And first of all, Reverend McKinney was upset, and he said, I got an 18% commitment of black workers throughout this project. And I know to have black, y'all didn't even check with me. So that was the only time that I'm aware of that both Tyree Scott and Larry Gossett had to write apology letters to him, Mt.Zion Church, and the broader black community. But we learned from it. I know that I learned from it in particular. I don't just go into action without checking out both sides and do a little reading on what's going on. And I owe that to Reverend McKinney.
And he did forgive you.
Yeah.
After you apologized.
He will forgive you.
Nate, you and your wife had a situation where she was going in for surgery. Mm-hmm. And but before she did, the doctor came out and met with the Reverend.
Yeah, we at the time were faced with a really bad surgery. My wife was hit with an aneurysm and required brain surgery, and it was going to be very touch and go because the machine that was supposed to find out exactly how bad the aneurysm was out of order. So we had to wait 24 hours for them to get the part for it. Mm-hmm. And during that time, we didn't know, but we just knew she had to stay completely still once they had got the bleeding to stop. Mm. And during that time, word got out. It was the day before Thanksgiving. And during that time, Reverend McKinney sent out the word, and I mean, Mt.Zion just took over the hospital. They brought food, they brought blankets, and took over every waiting room. They fed people who were in town, they fed the staff. It was just completely amazing how our church came to, but that's the way Mt.Zion was. Yeah. And so right before, and we checked out the doctor, he had to be this doctor. I mean, we were calling around to make sure we had the best neurosurgeon that money could buy for Leslie. And right before the surgery, he was in the surgery room, in the operating room, prepping to do the surgery. And he comes out and he says, I'm looking for Reverend Samuel McKinney.
This is the surgeon.
And the surgeon. Yeah. And Dr. McKinney said, do I know you? And he said, no, you don't know me, but I know of you. And he said, if you would just bless my hands before I go in and do this surgery.
That's powerful. That's powerful.
I would be so honored. And it was just one of those things because everybody was so worried. And once he said that, there was like this hush. It just came over the room, and peace, because you just knew it was going to be okay. And after that, they said they didn't know if my wife would ever be able to have kids again. We got 3 great kids, and a lot of it just has to do with Reverend McKinney, because, I mean, he just goes into places where, you know, you never knew who would know him. Yeah. Across the country, across the city, across this county, and that was one of the examples of that happening.
Power of faith. Power of faith. When I did the documentary with him, I had asked him, I said, what worried him about America? And this was 20 years ago, 1998, when we sat down and talked.
That America, as we know it, that is supposed to be the home of the free and the land of the brave and all that sort of stuff, could be destroyed within the next century. Because again, there are some males in our society who feel threatened by the fact that this nation will no longer, by the middle of this next century, be the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation that it has been in the past. Instead of seeing this as a plus that really make and evolve a stronger, better nation that resembles what I think God had in mind when all of this was created, they're fearful of it.
He was concerned and fearful that as we reach this time, that there was going to be this split in the country. 20 years ago he said this. Mm-hmm. And here we are today, and we are seeing much of this. So it was kind of, you know, sort of the prophecy that he could see, and it was his concern until the day he died.
Yeah, he was always very, like Nate so eloquently provided an example for us a minute ago. He was also always so prescient. He could kind of see what was happening and predict, or at least ask the people to have faith that that's the way it'll come out. Kind of similar to Martin Luther King's speech the night before he died, where he said he had seen the promised land. And Reverend McKinney was optimistic, but he always had the practical, realistic foundation for his optimism, and said, but this is not going to change until we get together and open up the industry. We get together and improve our school. We get together and stop this housing desegregation. We already talked earlier. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. came to Seattle on November 8, 1961, only because his schoolmate, Reverend McKinney, asked him to start the movement around open housing, and he came and did that. We still didn't get open housing in Seattle until '68, but from day one, Reverend McKinney said, we're going to get it, and we got it.
And he led that battle all the way through.
Yeah, he led that battle all the way through.
The two of you, do you think you'd be here without his support and guidance?
Be here with...
Be you as a councilman and as a businessman. You
know, it would be more difficult and definitely harder to be here without the consistent support of the powerful leadership of Reverend Samuel Berry McKinney. And that's why I was so happy that we already renamed the street after him before he died, and various other structures. Yeah, I can comfortably say that is the case.
Yeah.
I think that I think I would definitely agree with Councilman Gossett. I probably would be somewhere far in my career, but nowhere near where I am today without Reverend McKinney. I mean, the calls that it's like trying to figure out where would you be. You know, that's a what if game. I mean, 3 phone calls I can think of today that I would not have been were it not for Reverend McKinney. So that made a difference. That I was at a tributary in my life, and going the other way probably would have taken me down a rabbit hole that I never would have come out of. But because of the guidance that he gave me, I never went down that way. So I couldn't answer that question, but I would say I am so much better today because of him. I think King County is so much better. I think the country is so much better because Reverend Dr. Samuel Berry McKinney came this way. Yeah. I really do.
A legacy, yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted to add something real quick. I think that that's a reciprocal kind of relationship, because in the late 60s and early 70s, very few people know that Reverend McKinney, the head of the Seattle Urban League at that time, Edwin Pratt, Jerome Page, in most cities, they were scared of the Black Power advocates. Reverend McKinney invited us in and had a quiet side meeting where we talked about, we think we can open up 500, 1,000 jobs for black youth in Seattle, but let us go down and talk to the chamber, but we're going to tell them if they don't listen to us, they're going to have to deal with the Young Turks, and we just want to figure out a way to work this out. And our faith, our respect as Black Power involved youth and young adults in this community just grew by leaps and bounds, because Reverend McKinney said, let's have these meetings, and they bore fruit. But he came to us periodically and said, I really like the work that you all are doing. In many cities, they wouldn't coordinate with us. You all did. He's come to me as an elected official and said, call on me and my congregation anytime, because you're raising the right issues downtown, and we'll be supportive. So it was reciprocal.
Yeah, and he put himself on the line because as Edwin Pratt, who was assassinated, there was concern that Reverend McKinney might also be a victim of violence. He had a lot of threats against his life, but yet he still kind of soldiered on to do all of that and still worked in the community to do all of those things too. I want to close with this one thing. That he said to me, and I think it's fitting, then 40 years ago as he was wrapping up his career, and now as his life has come to an end, but he's moved on. He says, the church can retire a pastor, but only the Lord can take a preacher. You know? So it can retire a preacher. Right. And that's exactly what happened. And so he's with God and still doing his work, no doubt.
He will, I know I'll always remember, I remember one time, I'll do, if I can, I don't know, but I remember being in, he's so well known across the country. I was with Coretta Scott King one time down in Atlanta, my favorite story about Reverend McKinney, and I was just going on and on. I was filling my oats and talking about how I was the man in Seattle and I run Seattle and you know, and I'm just the man in Seattle. And Mrs. King was sitting there, and Ralph Abernathy was sitting there, and one other civil rights leader was sitting there, and Mrs. King in her quiet way said, young man, she said, so let me just get this straight. So you're the man in Seattle? And I said, yes, ma'am, as a matter of fact, I am, not realizing that I'm getting deeper into it. Yeah. And she said, really? She said, and you run the place? And I said, mm-hmm. She said, well, that's awfully strange. The last time I checked, Dr. Samuel Barry McKinney ran Seattle. And I quickly said, oh, did I say I ran Seattle? I was the man. No, what I said was he deputized me. I was his deputy, and he let me. Yeah, I had to quickly change because of, you know, but that's just, you know, that's just how Dr. McKinney was. He was so loved by that by the whole King family, especially Mrs. King.
Well, now you know.
Yeah, now you know. Yeah.
And he's probably looking down saying, Nate, remember that.
Yeah,
You know, you're just my deputy.
That's
both
right.
you and Gossett. So,
That's right.
Gentlemen, thank you very much
You're
for
welcome.
sharing your memories, and no doubt of a man that did so much in this community, in this region, in this state. Struggle continues, and that's what I'll tell you
to
this
continue
day.
on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for King County Connects. Visit us online at KINGCOUNTY.GOV/KCTV. I'm Enrique Cerna, and we'll see you next time.